almost everyone in the gaming community knows how crazy Kingdom Hearts lore is. After all, there's so many games that span many years with different consoles. If you only had one console, then you were kinda shit out of luck if you wanted to play every Kingdom Hearts game, unless you had a PlayStation and don't mind waiting a decade for a game collection to come out, which sometimes doesn't even come out with the full game, but rather a movie collection for those crazy about lore. I mean, I guess they saw that no one wants to play Recoded, so good choice. I'm still trying to get through that game. It's like the worst game ever. Kingdom Hearts has over the years been that one game series everyone says is the insane series where it's confusing. There's too many elements added to it, yada yada. It's too hard to keep up with how many games Squeenix is pumping out. But what if I told you there's a series that's even crazier than Kingdom Hearts, and the IP has been relatively dormant this past decade, yet it came out around the time Kingdom Hearts 1 came out. Sounds a bit unbelievable, right? Enter the Dot Hack series. So Dot Hack is a series that was made by Namco Bandai in a collaboration with Cyber Corporation. And it spans quite a few games here. You might know a lot of Cyber Connect's games being connected to games like Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm and later Sword Art Online. Crazy how they worked on Sword Art Online after working on Dot Hack, huh? They must have a thing for online games where you die in real life or whatever. Anyway, sometimes I think I've lost too many brain cells to be functional, and I blame the fact that I grew up as not just a Kingdom Hearts kid, but also a Dot Hack kid. Imagine being 9 and trying to fit all this lore in your head. It's almost fated to explode. While Kingdom Hearts had a lot of games, Dot Hack had a lot of, well, everything. Sure, there were 9 games released, unless you count Fragment as 10, but they were for the most part released on the PS2, minus Link on PSP and that one fighting game that came out with the Dot Hack GU trilogy movie on the PS3. Most of them are also kind of like the same game, but like split up into 4 parts. You're like, it was kind of scummy at the time, but back then it was kind of like normal practices. Like if you ever played Xenosaga with the 3 games, they all were kind of the same overarching story, but separated into 3 games. That was like that with Dot Hack, with R1 being split up into 4 games and R2 being split up into 3. But then later we got Last Recode, which connected all the 3 games and added a 4th game for R2, so kinda crazy. Anyway, if you had the money to buy all the games, you didn't need to invest in a new console on top of that. The real difficulty of being into Dot Hack is that in its heytime, it released too many things. Anime, manga, novels, video games, card games, movies. While most people see Dot Hack as a video game franchise nowadays, it's more accurate to put it as a multimedia franchise. That's because nearly every series of content related to Dot Hack is canon and important to the overarching story, except for random XD stuff like the 4-Koma manga or stuff like Cell that wind up getting chopped into pieces and kinda canon, kinda not canon because it never got finished kinda stuff. Imagine being into Kingdom Hearts, but the info about the Organization 13 was hidden behind a manga you probably didn't know existed because this is 2004 and your mom never gave you a computer with functioning internet. And yet, as a kid, I somehow was able to follow along to the plot of Dot Hack relatively easy. Nowadays, if you want to get into Dot Hack, you have to look at really complex timelines. Well, Kingdom Hearts is essentially the story about Sora at the end of the day. Of course, we get some stuff like Birth by Sleep into that bit, but it typically is just about Sora's experience. Dot Hack has 3 arcs of it that's very important. R1, R2, and RX. Maybe another one would have happened if Quantum's OVA resulted in a boom of more Dot Hack stuff, but that never happened, so Quantum's new version of the world isn't as impactful on the overarching story, honestly, but I just wanted to point out that there was a 4th R version. Dot Hack takes place in a World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV inspired world called The World. The reason it has 3 arcs with R in front of each is because the world has gone through 3 or 4 if you count Quantum major revision and re-releases, hence the R. R1 was the original game with a regular fantasy setting, and its lore and everything was the closest to the original story material's intentions. The world was inspired by a poem called The Epitaph of Twilight, written by an in-universe deceased poet named Emma Whelan. A programmer was in love with her and vowed to create a world with her in it after her passing, based on her poem. He also had a crazy idea to create an artificial intelligence by making a program that would have a child with him, acting as an intermediary of Emma so he could have a child with Emma. This shit was wild. But yeah, basically this crazy guy, Harold Hewick, was the programmer behind R1 and came up with the framework for everything. Plot happens over the series, and a few years after the events of the video games, anime, manga, etc., a fire breaks out at the company and destroys the server hosting the world. Only a few pieces of data were recovered from the wreckage, and what do you know, it's probably the worst or most convenient pieces of data possible to be recovered. After 3 years of silence, R2 comes out. Now, by this point, it's 2017, and Harold is presumably dead, going by stuff thrown of him in R1, so he didn't have any real involvement in R2, minus pieces of data taken from his game. There's also the fact that Harold Hewick literally put himself into R1, so the fact that R1 got destroyed in a fire kind of means that if you technically count him as being alive, he's now technically dead. R2 is a lot more steampunk inspired, though still with the fantasy setting. This era in fandom is tended to be seen as the GU era, since R2's content is for the most part very interwoven with the plot of the GU video games. Dot Hack Roots is an anime you literally should watch before playing the GU games, due to it covering the time jump that happens in the first game within the first hour, and gives you Haseo's motivations over that time. It's possible to play GU without this knowledge, but the significance of Shino and some other characters and everything becomes lost in the process, and I just generally like, oh my god, people, if you only played Last Recode and you didn't watch Dot Hack Root, you're missing out on so much characterization of Haseo, I'm serious. Now, what if I told you that during R1 there was another game not connected to the world that would later become the framework for a new version of the world that also had connections to Harold Hewick, you know, the guy that died in the fire? That game is known as Akashic Line, which was released in 2014, which is right around the golden age of R1 for those confused. 2014 was an important year for the world since it was relatively safe to play in and booming in business, but that was also the year the server destroying fire broke out, so to say a game called the Akashic Line was released that year is a little sus, right? It was even made by the same company. So basically, Akashic Line was a test made by a CC2 employee for his real digitalization technology. This technology is extremely similar to what Harold used to put himself into R1. This person was trying to become like Harold was in R1 and ran tests on users during the beta. It was never released outside of the beta, but considering it was on CC2 servers, never touched, never got rid of or anything, and during R2 a pretty big bug virus swept the game servers, it's no surprise that that very same virus infected Akashic Line as well. So, what do you do with a beta game that was essentially a test to make yourself exist in a video game that was infected with a virus that resulted in so many people in 2017 to fall into comas, especially as a virus that seemed to prey on people's mental illness and instability? You use that as a foundation for a new game version of the world, duh! So, yeah, that's how RX works here. RX uses a lot of the same technology used in R1, but also has the infectious virus of R2 inside of it. RX is a mold of the two versions, in more ways than one. The other way it combines the two is that Link, the game that takes place in RX, literally involves time travel between the two versions. Yeah. And this is where I say again that if you only played the games, you'd wind up a bit confused. A lot of the main characters you wind up encountering in Link are characters from not just the games, but the animes as well. While Link does do a deep dive on these characters, since it's about solving time anomalies, your connection to these characters will be severely lacking if you don't know anything about them. This sounds confusing. Yeah, it is confusing. Where should I start? It's generally recommended to start with R1 content first because even if you decide to skip on RX, possibly because there's no official English release of Link, there's still a lot of connections in R2 to R1. You do know this is a video game, right? Specifically an MMORPG. And if you're truly obsessed with Final Fantasy XIV or World of Warcraft, you're typically not just gonna stick to one character, right? You wanna try out all of the other classes and stuff, right? You're gonna have multiple accounts. And that's just what happens in .hack. R2 may be a departure from R1, but does still have that bit of data that was retrieved in the fire. That data is related to the big baddies of R1. The guys that mess shit up in the games and anime and all that good stuff. However, luckily, the data was able to be reworked to where these baddies are actually besties in R2. God, why did I write that? Anyway, these pieces of data, which I'll refer to now as Epitaph, gets connected to 8 users in R2. Why these people? Because most of them were players in R1 with a connection to that baddie in specific. While there are some that, as far as I know, never played R1, like Sakubo, most of them definitely have a connection. Whether the baddie killed their character in R1, leaving them in a coma in real life, whether they worked at the corporation and were used as test subjects for the avatar system of using an epitaph, most of the epitaph users have a connection to R1. The game doesn't really tell you that, though, for the most part. You need to do some detective work to find that out. Most people wouldn't have known Haseo's connection since, as far as he knows, this is his first time playing the world with R2. Of course, this has thoroughly been spoiled by now, what with his past identity was in the Begins edition of Last Recode, coming out with a manga that pretty blatantly spells it out for you who he used to be. But back then, you really did have to be pretty good with the knowledge of the franchise as a whole to connect Haseo to anything outside of R2. And that's kind of part of why I love the series. Unlike Kingdom Hearts, which, while it's confusing, most of the information is handed to you in the games, character connections in .hack are hidden within its manga and anime, and you can, for the most part, function without the knowledge if you decide to play only the games, but you still will lose a lot of the lore with it. Every bit of the world is done so detailingly. That's why it's such a behemoth to be held in our Lord and Savior last year of RX being in service, 2022. Are you interested in tackling this mountain? I'll try to help you out in a way that makes it more manageable. While I tend to recommend AI Buster, a novel, as your first stepping stone, since its protagonist is a beta tester for Fragment, it's not as accessible. But yeah, let me go over AI Buster a bit here. So yeah, its protagonist is a beta tester for Fragment, which I didn't really touch upon earlier, but it's another version of the world that was the base for R1. Kinda like how Akashic Line was for RX. In this manga, you get to witness things that become pretty important legends in R1's video games, such as the legend of Orkan Balmong and the first beta Aura existence. One of the characters is also a poet that becomes the second biggest poet in the series after Emma Whelan. Poetry is pretty important for this game series after all. That said, AI Busters isn't as accessible like I said before, so if you can't find a way to read it, I tend to recommend watching .hack Sign first. .hack Sign takes place roughly before and around the same time as the IMOQ/R1 video games, and comes from the perspective of a player that is trapped in the game world with no way of logging out. The anime has a lot of interwoven storyline with the game and helps progress the game's plot in some ways, such as when the cast meet Harold in-game and get some snippets of what's going on. There's also one episode that literally, has the characters from the video games meet the characters from .hack Sign, so that's another thing to keep in mind.
This shindig looks like the bomb diggity.
What'd you say?
What I mean is it's not bad at all.
The anime is also very important as its foundation of Aura, the goddess that is quite possibly the most important character in all of .hack minus Kite or Morgana, which, by the way, Morgana is also a big character in this anime. It also features the beta for a major character in the game, and if you can connect them to that character, their relationship to another character starts to make a bit more of sense, while also making their relationship a bit sadder. On top of that, it involves the creation of the first wave, which winds up becoming the avatars of R2 and a certain character in the anime. If you do some detective work, winds up becoming connected to Haseo, the protag of GU, if you're smart enough to piece things together. So yeah, this anime is really important to, everything. I would go on with recommendations, but this isn't really a timeline of .hack video. It's more or less just a video where I ramble about the craziness of the series with some connections of it to Kingdom Hearts to really drive home how deep this series goes. Which, again, we haven't gotten too much stuff outside of Last Recode this decade. Maybe someday we'll revisit the .hack world and experience another renaissance of multimedia magic. Though a part of me believes that with such a long-spanning project like .hack, having such a gap in time between content makes it even harder to get newcomers into. The series lore is so dense that even if they did what Kingdom Hearts did with a collection of all the games in one, you'd still be missing out on half of the content relating to the characters and world. That makes me sad to think about, but I also hope that by watching this, you might become a bit intrigued by this giant and give at least the R1 content I mentioned a try. So yeah, thanks for watching. .hack is pretty important to me. It's my favorite game series for the most part. I have a lot of favorite series, but .hack is especially important to me. It kinda made me who I was since I was an obsessed child when I got into .hack. But yeah, if you want a timeline video, there's a few timeline videos out there on YouTube. But if you want someone like me that grew up on the novels and the manga and the anime and stuff, I can do a timeline video someday too, though that might take a while since again this shit is crazy and there's so much shit, and I haven't even read some of the stuff like that one Epitaph of Twilight novel thing, whatever, that never got translated. So yeah. Just let me know what you thought of this video and what your thoughts on .hack are. Do you think it's too crazy to tackle? Do you want to tackle it? Are you a .hack fan? Let me know. Yeah, see ya.